on this beautiful, gracious morning that has given us. And we should all be grateful to be alive and present and here in this great sanctuary. Back in May, I was here and I did the lecture and I was talking about the divinity of man. Today we are going to explore that in part 2 from a different version. As we all know, life is made up of a series of stories. Stories that we tell ourselves, stories that have been told to us, stories that have been passed down through history, repeated, changed, different versions, but basically stories is made up of life, and life is made up of stories, different stories, and how your perception of those stories is. It's based on your beliefs, your understanding, your knowledge, and many different aspects. So, when I stood here back in May, I talked about how the gods stole man's divinity. That was the story, and it goes on that they were in council talking about where they would hide the divinity of man. And one god suggested that they send it all the way to the other side of the world and said, no, man is venturous enough, he'll go there and find it. Another one said, well, let's put it down at the depths of the ocean. Another one said, well, again, man is that very curious, and he'll dive deep into the oceans and find his divinity. And so the third one said, well, why don't we hide it in man himself, because that would be the last place that he would look for to find it. And so they did. So ever since then, man has been searching outside of himself to find his divinity. And so what struck me about that, and that is in that story, it's in the NSAC manual, and it's talked about the gods. I said, okay, gods, that's in plural, as opposed to we're a non-theist religion. We believe in one God, okay, infinite intelligence. So the gods, so that was my question. Sometimes when these things come to me, I have to research and find a different version of the same story, and we'll come across those facts as I go on. So anyway, I said, okay, gods, so that means there must have been more than one God. And in my research, I found that they're in the texts, in the Mesopotamian texts and so on, that there in fact is a council of gods. And again, this is all based on your understanding, beliefs, what you choose to believe, because we have free will. And so we get to choose what resonates with us as truth. So the story, where it begins, it's the split of polytheism, okay, which means a lot of different beliefs or a lot of different gods, okay? And then there's a monotheistic religion, which is like Christianity and Islam and Judaism. They believe in one God, one supreme God, emphasizing the oneness of the one God, but also the uniqueness, the supremacy, and the singular authority of that divine deity over all of creation. And we know that to be as infinite intelligence. Okay? So polytheism recognizes many or multiple gods. And so again, the research, why in that story, gods. And if we go through history, we realize that a lot of religions believe in many different gods. Okay? The god of war, the god of fertility, the god of the sky, and so on and so on. So that's where those religions were based upon the many different gods. So I can understand that when the story in NSAC talks about different gods. And yet those of us that follow the mono, which meaning one singular God, believe in the one God, or infinite intelligence. But all through history, all of these ancient religious believe in many different gods. So you get to pick which story it's however resonates with you. So the main focus has been from the time of Jesus that this story is the story for another lecture, okay, that the church or the religious institutions attempt to keep men in control. So we're not going to go down that rabbit hole, okay, between what religion, one chooses to follow. My point is that if there is one God in charge, or a collective of gods, as referred to in the book of Job, or if those of us that perhaps seen the movie Prometheus and we got the opportunity to, in one of my meditation sessions, to watch that movie because it talks about the same story from a completely different perspective. And not to give the whole movie away, but at the beginning, you see this being standing in what was to be considered the virgin earth, okay? The virgin earth, I mean pure. So he's standing on this cliff and you can see the raging waters and the beautiful, pristine quiet. And off in the distance, you see the spaceship taken off. So he was left behind as a sacrifice. Sacrifice, remember Jesus was sacrificed as well, so the parallel stories. And so he was left with a vial of poison. So he takes the poison and it starts working on him and he plunges into the virgin waters. So the purpose of that is so that his body disintegrates, and within the movie you see the DNA and all of that stuff, and that's supposedly how man was created. Again, a different version of the same story, or stories, however you choose to believe. Now remember that those of us that go to church, and many of us come from a different religion, and then found spiritualism. Those religions basically teach us what the book says. Again, stories that men were, passed down, inspired by, but again, stories from men. And the institutions, like I started before, choose to delete a lot of stuff that gives us back our power, that gives us back our divinity. And so even a lot of the scriptures, unless you do researches, you find that there was a lot of stuff taken out because, again, it gave us too much power. And those institutions, if they don't have a power, then they don't have a business, if you will, because religion has gotten to the point where it's become a business, okay? And mostly all religions, you see these mega institutes with the billions and stuff, and yet we still claim that there's poverty and people that are starving, and so on and so forth. So what has following those books has taught mankind, okay? When we should be talking about, again, finding our divinity, living our divinity, that divine spark of God that resides within each of us. So, Kathy had sent me this video with Greg Braden on YouTube, and the channel was, from the podcast, was Jesus Way. And I've seen it before. The gentleman's very well versed in the scriptures, and not so much Bible thumping, but to give us an understanding of the true meaning and the true things of Jesus, okay? And so, as I was listening, my husband was at the doctor that day, and I was the only one in the lobby. So I said, well, let me listen to this. And at some point, when he starts talking about the divinity man and the gods, something shifted in me, and I had to pause for a while and kind of regain composure, okay? And again, when we get a shift, we don't always immediately go back if we get to the understanding that something really kicks in deep within us, an understanding of something that sounds really true, it resonates deep within us, okay? And so, in that podcast, Greg Braden, and I'll give you his credentials a little later on, besides being a scientist, he's talking about exactly that, the council of gods. The God, as most of us understand, is one God within a council. So again, going back to the story of the council of the gods, leading to where we're going to hide man's divinity. And so it goes, and this podcast goes really deep into the understanding from Greg's point of view, how the gods and all of this came about. And that's where I heard about the movie Prometheus. I said, I have to watch this to get the true understanding. So in this podcast, he goes on to not just talk about it, but gives actual documentation data from the sacred texts about how man's divinity is important. What the gods put in us. They didn't steal God's divinity. They put God's divinity in man, okay? You choose how the interpretation goes. And so he talks about, using the previous one here, let me get back on track here. Okay. So, and by the way, that website, Jesus Way, is with Aaron Abike, A-B-K-E. And again, they was discussing this topic of man's divinity to full length. And in that podcast, Greg Braden is also talking about his new book, which is The Pure Human. And according to him, from a scientific point of view, if we continue down the path that we're on now, basically with AI and all of this other technology, advanced technology, this generation of human beings now would be the last pure humans. And in that podcast, he talks about how over in Europe already there's people walking around with at least 10 chips, doing their banking, telephone, and everything else that you could imagine. And so he was in the scientific community, and they were discussing, and one scientist came up to him and said, "Well, Greg, don't you think that that's man's advancement?" He said, "Absolutely not. When we start putting artificial things in this body, in this temple that houses our divinity, that's really not an evolution, but a devolution." Again, so again, his point of view, he's very well versed in the community of those that follow him. And so anyway, he goes on to give evidence as to what was put in man, okay, the divinity of man. He also says that, in fact, this body is made of the earthly elements, which we know that, but even from a scientific point of view, they don't know what actually the God's put in us that makes it so special, okay? And so he goes on and referring to the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Magdalene Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, that all alluded that something was given more than even our creators had, a potential that allows us to use my place here. A potential that allows us to be even more than our creators, okay? And what is that potential? It is, in fact, our divinity, okay? And so how you ever choose to express what is the divinity, what is the divine spark within, that's something that even this modern age, with all of this AI and all of this kind of stuff, the battle's no longer between the darkness, the light and the dark, okay? The battle's actually for our souls, our sovereignty. But we're not going to go there. Again, that's a topic for a different conversation. Again, and the emphasis is on man's divinity, okay? And if you look around you, this modern age has gone to the point that they keep us distracted from our true essence, that we don't even have time to sit, unlike you, that are sitting in this church exploring, getting back to the point of why we're even here, okay? Which has to do with our own divinity. Okay. And so, in one of the conversations, Greg Braden also quoted that Jesus came to remind us that the kingdom of God is within. Okay? And what is the kingdom of God? If it's not the divine spark that the gods originally put in man. Okay? And so we need to remember that even this religion, as I mentioned earlier, a polytheistic religion, Greg Braden, just to give you a little background on him so that we're not just talking gibberish. It's a 5-time New York Times bestseller with 13 books under his belt. Okay? He's a scientist, an educator, a pioneer in the emerging paradigm, bridging science and social policy and human potentials. Okay? There are also many men and women that spend their lives researching and investigating, deciphering many ancient texts that have been archaeology excavated, and scriptures that have been found. Okay? One of the sites that I also go on when I'm in quest and search, researching about religion or different aspects of many religions, because no one religion holds all the truth. Like the same says, there are many roads, many paths to Rome. Okay? One of the other ones is again, religion for breakfast. And this gentleman, he also talks about the many different texts and exploring, not just talking about it. Again, these people have spent their lifetime researching and exploring a lot of these texts and deciphering and presenting perhaps a true version, because nobody really knows but the truth. All truths are half-truth and all lies are but half-truths. Okay? And so, and there's also another YouTube part, which is The Funny Old World. And again, these are all religious-based, not from a religious point of view, but from a spiritual point of view. And, some of the points that Greg had brought up, and a lot of these people brought up, are the Mesopotamian texts, okay? And these texts comprises of a rich corpus of literature, letters, chronicles, legal documents written in Sumerian, in the Akkadian cuneiform, reflecting a civilization's religious, historical, and literary achievements, okay? Now, in our modern day, as we understand God, we have evolved from a vengeful God, okay? The God that's vengeful. If you sin, he's going to condemn you to eternity in hell's fire, etc., etc., etc. So we went from that understanding, from what religious points, to a loving God, a compassionate God. But even beyond that, that was not good enough for us. Again, as man is always progressing and evolving. So now we've come to the understanding that our blessings or misfortunes we attribute to God. It's God's will. So if God benefits you, it's his will. And if he doesn't benefit you, it's God's will as well. So before we used to say that the devil made me do it, so we used to blame the devil. And now, God's our punching bag, if you will. If he bless you, he's a kind, loving God. And if he doesn't bless you, it's okay because he's still your God. Okay? And so it is his will. We attribute everything to outside of ourselves. And from our point of view, we should really understand that the divine spark of God is, in fact, a fractal aspect of God. So if you believe that theory, then you should also believe that you are God in making. That says if you take a drop of the ocean water, the whole ocean is within that drop. Okay? So that divine spark of God that's within us, it's also an essence of God. And we have the same potentials as God, if you will. Perhaps not all the power, because we can't control anything beyond ourselves. And again, the kingdom of God is within. So in understanding the many different stories that have been passed down through us, through the ages, from people's own perspective, from people's own understanding, from people's own wisdom, okay? Perhaps not all of it is true, but it's certainly not all false either. Because our perspective is a perspective based on our beliefs, understandings, our experiences, because that's why we incarnated in this 3D world, to experience, not good or bad. Those are labels that we stick on. Okay? Experiences are meant for us to learn from. The other day, one of the gentlemen that I don't really follow him on per se, he was talking about that sometimes we need to go back and look at things from a different perspective. Because the things when we first see it, again, if we label it good or bad, there's always the lesson behind it. There's always the reason. Nothing happens by chance. Okay, and again, if we're going back to the perspective of God, if God supposedly, or the gods, created all of this, you think that God would make a mistake? Perhaps some of us do say make a mistake, because why then there is so much cruelty, okay? That's man's choice, because in fact he gave us free will. And so we have the choice to do good, to live within our divinity, or to do otherwise. Okay? The world is not based on one aspect, not one truth. Like I said, all stories have two sides, or perhaps many different sides from many different perspectives. And so it is up to us to search our truth, to search our divinity, to try to understand each other, and not look at so much the ego or the personality that is also a part of us, but look beyond that and look at the divine spark within the human being. To look at someone with compassion, with understanding, with empathy, and perhaps even with forgiveness when we think that they have done us wrong or an injustice. Forgive and forget. Not so much forget, because you should remember not to repeat the same mistake, or allow yourself to be taken down the path or taken out of your divine spark, your true essence. A lot to take in, but again, we're in this 3D world to experience life, however we choose to label it. But remember, you are a fractal aspect of the divine or infinite intelligence. And it is our mission to look at each other with compassion, with empathy. Because that is our purpose, to serve one another as we are all one. And so I leave you with this food of thought, and when I get the opportunity once again to present perhaps from a different perspective of a different story, with the inspiration of God, or infinite spirit, or even my own spirit guides, I look forward to serving you once again. Have a blessed day.